We are now live.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Hot Topics panel, the 2020 election and its impact on international trade and investment. My name is Srimushnam, and I'll be moderating this panel this afternoon. After introduction, our speakers will spend most of the time addressing the impact of the upcoming US presidential election on trade and investment policy, and we'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Please use the chat function to draft your questions, and I'll turn to them at the appropriate time. I expect that we'll have a lively discussion this afternoon, but of course the speakers' opinions are their own and they don't represent the organizations that they work for. With that, I'll turn to our distinguished panelists in alphabetical order. First, we have Chloe Baldwin. Chloe is an international associate at Steptoe and Johnson, where she practices international arbitration and international trade law, representing sovereign states and private clients in matters arising under bilateral investment treaties, multilateral trade agreements, and under the auspices of the WTO covered agreements. Prior to joining private practice, Chloe served for 6 years in the Australian government's Office of International Law, where she represented the Australian government in international trade and investment disputes and advised on trade and investment policy in negotiating international agreements. Welcome, Chloe.
Thanks for having us.
Next, we have Patrick Pearsall, who's a partner at Allen & Overy, where he represents parties in commercial and investment arbitration. Prior to entering private practice, Patrick served in the US Department of Office of Legal Advisor for nearly a decade and departed as the Chief of Investment Arbitration. At Elle, Patrick led a team of attorneys who defended the United States in claims brought under treaties and fair trade agreements, and also advised on the negotiation of the investment provisions of the TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the US-China Bilateral Investment Treaty. Patrick is also currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Tej. Good to see everyone. Nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience, at least on the participants list.
Finally, we have Freddie Sourgens. Freddie is the Senator Robert J. Dole Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Oil and Gas Law Center at Washburn University School of Law. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of the investmentclaims.com, published by University Oxford Press. Freddie has authored or edited more than 80 articles, books, chapters, essays, textbooks, and edited volumes. His most recent books include Evidence in International Investment Arbitration, International Petroleum Transactions, and the Decarbonization and the Energy Industry Law, Policy, and Regulation in Low Carbon Energy Markets. Quite a mouthful. Freddie is currently co-authoring The Transnational Law of Renewable Energy with Teddy Baldwin and Catherine Bannett. Welcome, Freddie.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I expect we'll go into specifics about policies during today's discussion, but for the first question, I'd like to take a step back and understand what's at stake, or get a general sense of what's at stake in this year's election. Over the past 4 years, President Trump has in many ways pushed back against the broader liberal consensus on international trade as a vehicle for shared global prosperity. He's identified an America First policy and has withdrawn from the TPP and Paris Accords, renegotiated NAFTA, and blocked new appointments at the WTO appellate bodies, to name just a few. So given this, and Freddie, this is to you, is multilateralism, as we've broadly understood it over the last 3 decades, is that on the table this November?
Yes and no. Let me start with the no, and then pivot to the yes. I think in so many ways, the Washington consensus is already struggling, no matter who wins. So the Washington consensus of free trade and multilateralism as a optimistic view towards fostering free trade under the Washington consensus doesn't seem to be a policy that would be favored by either a Biden administration or in a second term of a Trump administration. That said, I think that the manner in which either administration would depart from the Washington consensus would differ drastically. I think that a Trump administration would push significantly towards bilateralism, whereas I would see a Biden administration follow sort of an Australian model of continued multilateral engagement at the same time as there's a significant retrenchment on the prior multilateral framework.
Patrick, Chloe, what are your thoughts on this?
Go ahead, Ted.
Sure, I'll go. I mean, I think Freddie's right. I mean, I think that it's giving the Washington consensus perhaps more credit than it's due to say that it's struggling. I think that it's in significant distress. I think that the idea that trade and investment policy is globally is set in Washington, and the idea that it's a consensus are both perhaps anachronistic at this point. I think the real question is whether the United States pursues what Freddie rightly identified as a bilateral posture towards trade and investment, consistent with a kind of nascent idea about what America first in the 21st century means, versus a multilateral approach that is more solicitous of international institutions and a concept of regional trade and investment policies that are right for that region, and a recognition that there's not one policy that is right for every relationship. So I think that that's really what's on the table. It's a kind of different outlook, but I do think that Freddie's absolutely right that the idea that foreign direct investment is a universal good that has been kind of the mooring post of any administration over the last 70 years, with only a few, marginal differences among them. I think that that's really under interrogation right now, and probably will be, irrespective of who becomes the next president. I think that who is investing, where are they investing, why are they investing, and how does that influence or prop up my foreign policy concerns and my ability to project my influence abroad is really going to be kind of a hallmark of the next 10 years of whatever the Washington consensus becomes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I do think Biden, if we kind of narrow it to the election, he has vast experience in foreign relations, and I think he will see more of a diplomatic focus on foreign relations than you have with the current presidency. But that being said, Biden is very concerned with domestic policies right now, and he's focused on the domestic market, and he's focused on dealing with coronavirus. And so I think, I wholeheartedly agree with the comments of Patrick and Freddie on multilateralism and the issues that in itself is currently facing. But I also think that we will see, it will remain prominent, but I think we will also see a soft approach, at least in the next few months, if it is a Biden administration compared to a Trump administration, as he refocuses his agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that I'd be curious about is my gut is that America First is a very extreme version of saying that global trade is a zero-sum game. But I do think that even in a Biden administration, the notion that trade is a net positive, not just investment is a net positive, but that trade is a net positive, is also going to be interrogated rather closely. So I would expect a less dramatic departure, but I would still expect there to be a sense of, to throw the M word in, a little bit of a mercantilist bent to trade policy in either administration, but again, with a softer edge to it in a Biden administration than a Trump administration.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you see, if you take the WTO as an example, President Trump has, said a lot that it's the worst deal America's ever done for it, but, there's been a lot of press because, the blocking of the appellate body members, which has thrown the WTO appellate body into crisis. But that process actually began under the Obama administration. And I don't think that it's clear that Biden would depart from the United States' strong policy position on that has been over a number of years and administrations now that, the WTO needs significant reform. So I think President Trump's trade policy agenda has been very strong and perhaps divisive, but I also don't think that we're going to necessarily see a departure from everything that he has kind of railed against, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, having been called by the president one of the worst trade negotiators in history, I don't know if he also thinks the WTO is the worst thing in history as well. So I think that there's a question. It's not so much a question of whether, because I think that the Biden administration, or at least what Vice President Biden has put out in his campaign, has not taken huge steps back from what was orthodoxy over the last 70 years on free trade and investment. I do think that it's going to be adjacent to certain progressive concepts, right? So I think there's going to be renewed focus or increased focus on labor, increased focus on environmental standards, on climate diplomacy and climate adjacent solutions. I do think, can people still hear me? Can people still hear me? That was a kind of a solution. I wonder what's going on there.
Hi, Tej. Sorry, that's coming from your end.
Solution. It was a good answer. I had a great answer, but I'm glad that you mixed it up into a rap beat, because that makes me seem all the more hip. I do think, however, that one thing that you're going to kind of see potentially in a Biden administration is a kind of an interrogation at the senior levels of what orthodoxy in trade and investment means today. So I think, saying that Biden is going to kind of be part of a narrative that Trump helped begin 4 years ago
Hi, Tej, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Tej, I think you need to stay on mute. Stay on mute, Tej. Stay on mute, please. Because then we'll open it up, and hopefully I won't still be saying solution. My point is that the world in which the Biden administration is going to find itself if it comes into power, what it means to be orthodox within a trade and investment free trade agenda has itself shifted. So I don't think that what being free trade and being kind of having a free trade agenda means is what it meant in 2008. Right, which may seem relatively obvious, but I think that one of the things that multilateralism will bring to a Biden administration is a collective understanding about what it means to be the world's largest economy today, right, with all of the challenges that are facing us with globalization. And I think that orthodoxy, whatever that Washington consensus is, has changed. So I think that that's going to be part of the discussion about the WTO and anything else. Now I'll stop, and hopefully the word solution won't continue. Oh, Tej is gone. So Freddie, what do you think about that? I mean, just to kind of be narrator for a second.
Yeah. I think part of what is so interesting is that we've gone through a rather significant shift in trade attitudes and investment attitudes in the global north. So when you look at the reaction in Europe, if you look at the reactions around the world, not just Brexit, but even before Brexit, when you had TTIP negotiations going on, there was a fundamental shift away that I think the global north is understanding that this is not a deal that is always net positive. Interesting.
Hi, Tej. Can you hear us? Sorry, I'm gonna have to mute you again. Let's talk through the chat. There's a sound coming. There's a repeating sound that comes from the computer. My apologies, everyone.
That's okay.
I will try to get to the bottom of this. I've never seen this before.
That's okay. We can carry on. Go ahead, Freddie.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, the fact that you have the global north coming together, and I think to a certain extent, because there is significant economic pain in the global north following 2007, 2008, there is a sense in which a rebalancing of trade and investment is kind of in the global north's interest. Now, what I find interesting is at the same time that there are significantly more South-to-South bilateral investment treaties, significantly more South-to-South free trade agreements. So it seems to be that simply the deck has shifted. I don't think that free trade is universally something that, and investment protection is universally something that is questioned. It just seems to be that we're going through a little bit of growing pain on our own end and are questioning it for, you know, policy questions should be reevaluated on a frequent basis. So this is a good thing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Tej, are you back?
I am back. Can everybody hear me okay?
Fantastic.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Apologies for that, everyone. I missed the last few minutes of discussion, but it looked as though everyone was doing just fine without me.
We were brilliant. We were brilliant. So you're,
which is, I guess, the
go.
point. So, well, to the extent that the question hasn't been asked, I thought we might move to the second question, which is that what are the specific decision points that a Biden administration is going to face in 2021? Issues that are going to come due and will be something that the Biden administration has to sort of look at one way or the other if they're granted a first term. Chloe, that's to you.
Thanks. I think, you know, apart from the WTO issue, which we've kind of discussed, I think this continuing theme of trade policy negotiations is really something Biden's going to have to confront early on. There are a number of negotiations ongoing at the moment, including with the UK, with Japan, with Kenya. I don't think that we'll see a massive policy kind of movement on that, and those negotiations are likely to continue. Despite Patrick being the worst negotiator in history, I think, you know, the TPP is something Biden's going to deal with one way or the other. You know, the comprehensive partnership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership of leaders have said that they would welcome a US renegotiation and re-entry. But Biden himself has said, you know, in 2019, I think that he wouldn't want to re-enter the TPP on the conditions that were originally sort of the policy focus in the beginning. I think, as Patrick mentioned, you know, labour, environment are all standards we could see Biden having to address early on. I think the other big thing we'll see is a question of what to do with tariffs, which has been a central point in President Trump's trade policy. We have the Section 301 tariffs against China. We have the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum against a number of countries, including allies such as the European Union. On the Section 301 tariffs, you know, it's not immediately clear that Biden would roll them back. He hasn't yet said whether he will maintain the Section 301 tariffs on China or not. He has said that he will work more closely with allies on China, and it may be that he will roll back the duties, but I guess this is particularly if he frames it as an action to help American consumers and businesses who've been hurt by the tariffs, which is kind of consistent with his domestic policy focus. On the Section 232 tariffs, it seems likely that he might drop the tariffs against states and you know, the EU. But again, given his focus on domestic policy, this might be hard to reconcile and explain to, you know, the domestic industry. So whether he takes a softer approach on phasing out tariffs through broader negotiations, or, you know, makes use of his past experience as a legislator and the importance of the congressional role in these issues to kind of negotiate a legislative approach to it, I guess remains to be seen. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my somewhat cynical thought is it may very well depend on, in a Biden presidency, which states he carried, because depending on which states he carried and what the mandate looks like that he has, he will have to adopt different trade policies. So a Rust Belt road to the presidency that is a very narrow win would give him a very different wiggle room than if he, you know, won Texas and, you know, Georgia and Iowa, at which point he would have a much broader mandate to, you know, follow what I would think would be a gut that would be, in that instance, more free trading, certainly with regard to the European Union. But if it is a Rust Belt victory and a narrow Rust Belt victory in the Electoral College, you might have to rethink that.
I mean, I'm not so sure that I'm not so sure he's going to be as transactional as that, in my view. I mean, one thing to watch, I mean, for sure, politicians are politicians, but one thing to watch is kind of who the Biden administration puts in place to kind of be in the USTR and as the Undersecretary for Economic and Business Affairs in the State Department. And I think that will be interesting for any number of reasons, but it'll also be interesting to see if there are good communicators there. Because one of the things that I think it will be very important to do in the first 4 years of a Biden administration is to reset the kind of educational narrative about the benefits of trade and investment to the American worker. And kind of that's central to what Vice President Biden would say, building back better. And I think that that's going to be a really important aspect of his trade and investment policy. And in particular, whether he is going to be a president for all Americans, or if he is going to kind of be almost a kind of more siloed administration where they're looking at kind of winners and losers on a state by state level. From what I see, the challenges internationally that the trade and investment agenda of a Biden administration are looking at are ones that are universal and multilateral, right? So trade, labor, and environment, climate, infrastructure in the United States. All of those are kind of irrespective of the locus of whatever industry is being looked at. But obviously tariffs and things like that will also come into play. So I'm not 100% as where Freddie is on kind of what November 4th does to the trade agenda. But I do think obviously, who is put into positions of power early on will really matter. So watch his cabinet very closely.
What are some signs, what are the particular personnel that you think may be an early indicator for us to look to in terms of understanding what trade policies a new Biden administration may be pursuing?
Well, I mean, I think that in part, the urgency of the first 100 days are going to be climate and COVID, right? I mean, right. Those at least for a Biden administration. So I think that the bandwidth of the presidency is immense, but I think that a lot of the kind of communication to allies and others will be around the global pandemic and, shoring up multilateral institutions that have been kind of left aside in the kind of more bilateral America First agenda approach of the Trump administration. So re-engagement with NATO, re-engagement with Paris, re-engagement, right? So that's, I think, going to define the early days. But I think who is the USTR someone who's going to be someone who is seen as an effective negotiator, effective communicator? Do they have specific ideas about trade and investment policy prior to government service? All of those will be really open questions. And I think the Biden administration will understand that signaling to the world, Lighthizer has been a very effective and big personality on the trade stage.
Right.
I personally would take heart if Patrick had a senior role to play, but that's just
Well, one sort of thread that seems to be running through the discussion appears to be that there are some trends that may have predated President Trump and may continue regardless of who's in the White House. And I'd like to spend a few minutes just touching on some of those themes. What are these general trends that we're going to see regardless of who's in the White House? Patrick?
Oh, again. All right. General trends. I mean, I think, look, I mean, we need to make globalization, well, it's not even globalization, it's probably not even the right word. We need to make things better for folks who have been left behind in a shrinking world. You know, as industry and trade and, you know, it all consolidates. There are significant segments of people who have been left behind, and we need to make sure we find a way to bring those folks along as development increases. And that's in a whole swath of different areas. And I think that either administration is going to be mindful of that and confronting that on a daily basis, right? You know, and there are ways that you can set policy that will, you know, from different viewpoints on how to effectuate that. But I think that that's a common trend among everyone. And, you know, the climate is changing. So, you know, that's true.
Yeah, I think the big trends, how they will differ is which perspective you will take. So I would expect a Republican administration, not just a Trump administration, but a Republican administration to be growth focused, so that economic growth and GDP remains the measure by which we assess whether we are doing well or not well. If you look at the moves that have been made under the Obama administration towards the end of the Obama administration, and you look at what is going on at the moment, I would think that human development would be far more at the forefront of what a Biden administration programmatically would look at, and they would look at the same kind of problems through a slightly different lens. And so the question is, do you think that growth fixes all things, or do you think that human development is something that is worthwhile even to the extent that it inhibits growth? And I think that's where you're going to see the clash of globalization paradigms between a Republican-leaning and a Democratic-leaning administration, not just in this election, but for elections to come.
Yeah, and I mean, I think apart from the broader issues, if you look at trade policy and investment as we have been, in some instances, there isn't a lot of daylight between the two in the position between the Republican side and the Democratic side. I mean, on investor-state dispute resolution, countries all around the world are pulling back from that a little, and you know, the experience of the last 20 years have seen disputes arise in ways I think states never anticipated. And I think Biden, you know, has said that he's not necessarily for wholesale investor-state dispute provisions in treaties, whether they're multilateral, plurilateral free trade agreement chapters or bilateral agreements, which are not so commonly negotiated now. But I think we see that trend continuing through. And similarly, as we discussed before, with the issues with the WTO, you know, there are these fundamental high, you know, issues that states, not only the US, are grappling with in trade and investment policy. And I think we're going to see that continue, I mean, inevitably.
And I think that that's right. I mean, in either case, right, you have a global, like, let's just think about the G7 or others. You have 4 years of learning about Trump's priorities that will be carried forward into another 4 years. And I think that you're going to see a world that is far more sophisticated in dealing with the United States as a trading partner than it has been in the first 4 years of the Trump presidency, if he were to win re-election. It was similar with Vice President Biden. You have a world that is kind of nascently aware of kind of where the Obama administration was on these issues. Granted, you know, as I said, I think the narrative has moved and orthodoxy has changed, but I think that they'll seek to re-engage. But I do think that one of the interesting things in a Biden administration will be the world will need to kind of invite the United States in a kind of multilateral way back to the table, you know, but I think that the world, if you can use kind of a portmanteau of everyone else, understands the United States and its role in a different way, in a fundamentally different way. And I don't think that that's necessarily because, Trump has been an iconoclast of institutions. I think it's because the nature of global investment and what it means to project foreign direct investment has changed. So I think that kind of how the United States integrates back into a multilateral framework will itself be a uniquely Biden-driven kind of effort, because I think the world understands the United States' role differently.
I absolutely agree with that. And as I mentioned before, Biden himself, Vice President Biden himself, has openly stated that the world is different now from when he was vice president, and things have moved on, and states are grappling with a whole lot of issues. I think states are ready to welcome back the US into sort of the global negotiations of multilateral agreements, particularly. You mentioned NATO before. Of course, we have the WHO, we have UNESCO, there's a whole lot of multilateral organizations that are kind of waiting to see how the next few months will play out.
Although I would assume that a lot of that will, on the one hand, yes, the United States has not behaved in the way that the United States has traditionally behaved in the last 3 some odd years, right? I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the understatement of the program. But anyway, the need for the United States is still where it was. I mean, it is going to be impossible to find global solutions to global problems without the United States in a leadership position. It's just undoable. So I think the frustration that you have from the rest of the world is that the United States has turned away from taking on that leadership role. Yes, there's going to be some hesitation about saying, well, we want some pre-commitment from you guys in case that things turn sour. But, the Paris Agreement had that pre-commitment device built right into it. With the withdrawal provision on the Paris Agreement, there was a very clear understanding by the rest of the world community that politics in the United States can influence foreign policy on key global challenges. And so I think that the world was ready for the moment and will continue to be ready for the moment. I just hope that the United States will, take on a more assertive role in resolving the problems that we have a huge interest in solving.
Freddie, I wanted to jump on the issue of climate change, and it's come up a couple of times now. Broadly speaking, how is climate change, as Patrick said, climate change is real, it's happening, and I think there seems to be a real consensus around that. And so if we take that as a premise, what are we going to see moving forward in terms of climate change and its effect on trade policy?
I think, so there are things that are going to move in 2 different directions. Let me take first the positive side of how this could work out. I think if you want to build back better, the tools that you will use are going to be, 1, the Paris Agreement and the Paris process, the COP process, and then the climate finance component of this. Climate finance is probably the most important component in successfully combating climate change, because there are too many states that are unable to actually meet meaningful reduction in their carbon dioxide output. And so climate finance is going to be key to actually making the kind of deep commitments that we will need to make in order to transform the world economy and meet the challenge. In order to do that, though, we will also need to have a trade and investment policy that is going to act as a pre-commitment device. I mean, the European Union is unhappy about the fact that investor-state arbitration is being used at the moment in order to force pre-commitments that were made towards green energy, that they will be kept, and that there's a consequence from stepping back from that. I think to the extent that you give those kind of teeth to a path towards climate finance and towards Paris compliance, you're going to have a very successful pathway as to how you can get from point A to point B. The downside is that there's a lot of existing investment in energy infrastructure that is a problem from the perspective of the Paris Agreement. And so then the question is, well, how do you deal with that? The existing teeth that are there are going to be inconvenient if one wanted to decouple from the existing energy infrastructure without paying fair compensation. And so that's going to be the problem of policymakers to come as to how is it that you square that circle. I just don't see that without the toolkit of climate finance and investment protection and free trade that we're going to be able to build back better globally. And it makes no sense to build back better locally because it's a global problem.
Patrick, Chloe.
Go ahead, Chloe.
I'm honestly not sure I can top Freddie's answer. Can I just incorporate it by reference? I absolutely agree. I mean, climate change is, something everyone is grappling with. And I think, as Patrick mentioned before, that we're going to see very quick action from the Biden administration one way or another on this issue and a re-entry to the Paris Agreement. I think if it depends in part, I think if the Democrats take the House and the Senate, what can be pushed through domestically to assist that process, I guess remains to be seen. And will definitely, perhaps limit one way or another what is able to be pushed through.
I mean, the only thing I'll add to this is just to kind of say that, one of the things that's uniquely US is our federal system. And I think seeing the administration, a new administration, the Biden administration, engage with states on these issues as part of the kind of US response to the challenges of climate change will also be interesting. And it's not something that has occurred in any meaningful way in the current administration. And I think that, how a Biden administration engages with California, right? One of the largest economies in the world, how it engages with Texas, how it engages with Pennsylvania, how it engages with New York, right? New Jersey, states that are really important to us meeting our Paris commitments will be something to watch. And, I think that that's also something that will be interesting to see and will also help drive policy, perhaps drive policy in a way that is more consistent with what Freddie mentioned earlier about kind of where kind of mandate strongholds have emanated from Election Day.
Okay. Well, if a lot does seem to be hinging not only on the presidential election, but also what happens in the Senate. If the Democrats do take both the Senate and the White House, are there changes to trade policy that we may see, or things that they may look to tackle the administration that they wouldn't if the Senate stays in Republican hands?
Well, gosh, I mean, yes. I mean, we have a system of checks and balances, and the Senate is an institution that is almost structurally meant to be small c conservative, and it's right. An essential institution to kind of getting things done. Query how much of the Senate will be in the new administration, right? I mean, obviously the obvious one that we know of is the senator from California will be the vice president. So presumably at some point she will resign her Senate seat and a senator will be appointed for her. And that will change the character of the Senate. Similarly, there's been chatter about Bernie Sanders wanting a role, perhaps as Secretary of Labor, Elizabeth Warren getting a role, perhaps as Treasury Secretary, Senator Murphy getting a role, perhaps as Secretary of State. I mean, the question of Biden presidency is that, Vice President Biden has spent a significant amount of time, as we're reminded, in the Senate. And I think he really trusts and respects some of his former Senate colleagues. So to the extent some of those senators are brought into the administration, I think the Senate itself will change irrespective of whether the Democrats hold it or not. And obviously that will be significant because each senator plays an enormous role in setting policy. So it's an open question. Obviously, if the Republicans keep the Senate under a Biden administration, I think you would probably see some form of the second term of the Obama administration, which means something. Ready?
Yeah, I mean, the part of the problem that you would have is partly foreign relations law driven, because it's unlikely that the Biden administration would ever command the kinds of majorities that it could just willy-nilly ratify treaties and what have you. So to the extent that things are going to move forward, I would presume that it would go the way of trying to legislate and instill in legislation certain treaty commitments. So I could see a Congress adopting the Paris Agreement as federal law, or parts of it anyways. And so I could see a move that would, have impact on foreign relations as a commitment device to say, look, now that it's law, it's going to be much more difficult in an administration change to undo. So I would see that. If the Republicans hold the Senate, there is going to be the temptation to say that what happened to the first term Obama presidency is going to continue, which is to say, we're going to make sure that then President Biden is a one-term president, and we're going to completely stall everything. We're not going to allow any legislation to pass. I would say that Vice President Biden has the one advantage of being really good at engaging with Senate Republicans. So I would tend to think that if that were to happen, that he would actually be able to get certain compromise things through. But, power politics being what they are, I would presume that there's going to be a lot less that gets done if there's divided government.
Yeah, I think that's right. If the Democrats hold the Senate, then I wonder if we will see, more of a push to change things at a fundamental level. I was talking about the Section 232 tariffs before, and I wonder whether, you might see a legislative approach to try and modify those type of tariffs, whether it's time limited or whether, they try and rein presidential, executive orders on that front in a little through the Trade Act. Tej asked before what we might see coming down the pipeline. Again, I think that depends on, policy approaches and how that interacts with Biden's general legislative agenda, if we're in a situation where we hold the Senate as well. And Freddie, you mentioned before about ratifying treaties, and that's something that I think is also, in a way, hanging in the balance. I mean, if you look at the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, Biden has previously been supportive of US ratification of that treaty back when he was in the Foreign Relations Committee. And, whether they would look to try and ratify some of those treaties that they're not part of. Now, I don't think the ratification of UNCLOS is necessarily a solution to, South China Sea issues, but it might neutralize sort of the argument that the US has not even ratified UNCLOS, and therefore it's a bit hypocritical. But
I mean,
it's too far down the path. Sorry, Patrick.
No, I interrupted you. I mean, it's interesting that some of the narrative, like, I was part of the last push to get UNCLOS ratified while it was in the Obama administration, and at the same table was Northrop Grumman and Greenpeace, right? I mean, there is a bilateral, or there's a broad tent on kind of why UNCLOS needs to be ratified. But interestingly, Secretary Pompeo just yesterday, I think, from the podium at the State Department, mentioned the Law of the Sea Convention and alleged China noncompliance with various obligations that it has undertaken under UNCLOS. So, to the extent it continues to be something that, has both crystallized into customary international law norms, fine, but also something that the United States sees as an important instrument, I think is still around there. And I think that, there are a few very vocal and I would say in some ways parochial views in the Senate that has prevented its ratification. But, hope springs eternal on a treaty of that size and breadth to which most of the world is already party. So we'll see. But it was interesting to see Pompeo's remarks.
And it just seems to me that it is one of the most bilateral, one of the most bipartisan issues out there. I mean, I don't see the unclosed ratification as particularly Democratic or Republican. It just is plain good sense. And so it as an immigrant, it just baffles me that it hasn't gotten done yet. I only relatively recently came to the United States, and that was sort of the one where I sort of thought, this is weird. But you sort of take the place as you find it. But that's the one I never could understand why on earth. You say parochial, they just seem to be plain wrong. I mean, the concerns against unclosed just seem to be unintelligible.
Well, the law, I mean, some of the, I'm not going to do them justice, so I don't want to add them, but I think that there's concerns around the law of the sea tribunal, and some of those aspects, but that's as I said, it's relatively parochial. But whether ratification of UNCITRAL is top of mind on the first 2 years of the Biden administration while they have the Senate is an open question.
Well, we have only we're getting near Q&A time, and I want to be mindful of that. But I did want to leave the question session before I had at least one question on China. And so, Freddie, this is to you. There have been a lot of changes that have happened with China, and a lot has been written over the last several months. It does look at some level like the strategic lens with respect to China is changing, regardless of whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican one. But there continues to be places for productive engagement with China, and I wanted to give you a chance to sort of talk about that, if you could. Where are places where, regardless of the kind of rhetoric we're hearing, there appears to be places where we can continue to engage with them constructively?
I think, the first thing to mention is that it is a reasonably bipartisan statement, I think, that China is a concern for U.S. foreign policy. The Obama administration already was shifting its approach to China. The TPP came out of an attempt to engage but box in China so that we would have an ability to set the terms on which we engage with China, not just bilaterally, but multilaterally. And I thought, Patrick, it was a really fantastic document. The notion that China is a competitor on the global stage is something that is not just the Trump administration, but predates it. And it's something that remains one of the large challenges. And unclosed, to my mind, the South China Sea is one of the most important issues that any administration will face. And that's where unclosed ratification would be a wonderful arrow in the United States foreign policy quiver so that it can speak to these issues with greater authority. That said, even though there is competition, I think it would be foolish not to also engage China. There are too many issues where it is impossible to achieve global goals without Chinese co-leadership. And I again look at climate as one of that. When the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement, or announced that it would pull out of the Paris Agreement because it shot the starter gun too early, everybody looked to China for its leadership, and it looked for a while like that was going to happen, and then China repivoted towards coal and away from renewables. So I think it will be important that the United States and China work together like they did when the Paris Agreement was being finalized. The nationally determined contributions of China and the United States were exchanged between the Obama administration and the Chinese government in order to make sure that both sides basically were on the same page. And I think we need to do that again. I think there needs to be a sense that China and the United States will co-lead where it is in everybody's interest that they do. And otherwise, hopefully, this is where rule of law is important. That competition will take place within the purview of the rule of law, and that the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, PCA arbitration, and all other tools that we have in the dispute resolution toolkit are going to be brought to bear to that, because that is, on so many levels, the greatest challenge for a rule of law based approach to global governance.
Yeah, that's well said, Freddie. And I think two just quick comments. And firstly, Chloe also was involved in TPP, so I'm not going to let her get away from not being in fact, her country is still party to it. So there you go. But leaving that aside, I think that two things. One, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort and diplomatic engagement before you see principals sit down and meet together, right? So that's the bread and butter of my colleagues at the State Department and elsewhere who have been doing a tremendous job over the last 3 years in projecting American influence abroad, and will continue to do that irrespective of who wins the next election. These are the highest and best use of all of us, these folks, so they do great jobs. So that's point one. The only other thing I'll say on China is it was really interesting in Thursday's debate to see the kind of back and forth on China. I don't think that Vice President Biden minced words in kind of his approach, which is China is a competitor. They are a country that needs to be engaged with diplomatically, but he is not going to allow no-fly zones inconsistent with international law, right? I mean, and he was very clear about that. So I don't see suddenly a lot of kind of hugs and smiles necessarily, but I do think that the kind of approach, the multilateral approach and the diplomatic approach and the rhetoric will change significantly, and sometimes that matters.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get time for Q&A, and it looks like we've got one here. Can you all still hear me? I had to shift to my phone, so I hope my voice is people can still hear me. It says, one question I do have is related to the TPIP and the future investment arbitration. Trade with America and ISDS in particular have become incredibly politicized within the EU during the TTIP negotiations. One of the outcomes of that was that the EU proposal for a multilateral investment court, which I understand is now part of the UNCITRAL investment reform discussions. In your view, how viable is the creation of such a court?
Well, I think that could be a topic all of its own, and in fact has been. I think it's incredibly complex in 3 minutes, but let's give it a go. I mean, this is one of the tensions you see with states on ISDS is the viability of the creation of a multilateral investment court. And you have the EU on one side pushing it through UNCITRAL Working Group 3, trying to create it through their TTIP. They've included it in their treaties with Vietnam and others. And then you see on the other side, states really starting to pull back on their investor-state provisions. I mean, my home country, Australia, has just recently announced it's reconsidering its policy and asking for public submissions on how to deal with it. You see withdrawal from the ICSID from a few countries, including, Venezuela. You see, India terminating a lot of its bilateral investment treaties. And this is one of the greatest tensions, I think, in ISDS and the whole work of UNCITRAL Working Group 3 is to navigate this path forward and how to resolve those tensions. I'm not sure, Patrick, whether you have some amazing insight on the multilateral investment court.
I have no insight other than I think that its promulgation by the EU and some of the EU's partners has been a significant step in a direction. I don't want to characterize whether that's in the right direction or the wrong direction. It's been a significant moment in really crystallizing some of the major concerns that state parties have with regard to the obligations they undertook in their investment agreements. And for that, just the debate about the court has been, I think, on net, a good thing for the international investment law generally. Now, whether as an institution it will be set up successfully and will get buy-in from states outside of the kind of EU and its trading partners, and kind of what that looks like and what it does to investment law, that's a story that is still in its early days, in my view. I think it's still in its infancy. These are huge endeavors. But the debate around the court, just from a kind of pedagogical way, kind of states educating themselves on these obligations and these procedural mechanisms and what that means for protection of investment, and whether that means promotion and how to enact consistency, and all of those questions has really been a debate worth having. So whether the UNCITRAL mandate ends without a formal recommendation or not is kind of almost beside the point. I think that the EU member states will do what the EU member states want to do. And I think that their trading partners will decide, what the balance of power is on kind of whether to accept that or kind of ad hoc. And, for right now, APEC nations are not particularly enamored with it, and they might still not be, even if it's up and running. So that seems to me to be okay. I don't think you necessarily need one forum to rule them all, but I do think that having these questions about the court have been on net positive to the community of folks who are kind of nerds about this stuff. I don't know, Freddie, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the court, mostly for procedural reasons, which is that what we saw happen to the appellate body is always a problem when you set up a standing court, that there is then the ability to politically influence its behavior and what have you. That said, those are, to my mind, really minor points. I would assume that the world of investor-state dispute settlement will continue turning in pretty much the same way that it did in the current paradigm of investor-state arbitration, whether we're in a court or not, because I would assume that many of the people that are currently sitting as arbitrators would probably find their way onto the court, and that these people wouldn't change their views overnight because now they're a judge and before they were an arbitrator. So I think in the end, the question is one of nomenclature and legitimacy from a political point of view. And so, to the extent that people feel like that is going to advance legitimacy, that's great. I think that it comes with a lot of institutional ties that I don't necessarily like, because the more institutionalized something becomes, the more of its own politics it develops. But I think that's the lesser point.
Chloe, Patrick, any responses? We're a little bit over time, but I did want to give you a chance to speak if you'd like.
I mean, I have a whole lot of thoughts.
I had a feeling that wasn't going to go unanswered.
But if we're over time, I will hold on to them for another day, perhaps.
Saved by the bell.
Well, Patrick, Chloe, Freddie, thank you so much for joining us. And I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I really look forward to being able to do this again. So thank you again for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to you and
Thank you.
The organizers of the whole weekend. It's been great.
Been excellent. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.